The truth is that for many, many years in Queensland, even supposedly rusted-on blue-collar ALP voters regularly voted for Joh, agreeing with his core conservative philosophies and his just constant, unrelenting focus on creating jobs and opportunities for Queenslanders.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Now today we turn to one of the most formidable, controversial and in some respects impressive and respected figures in Australian political history, Sir Joh Bjelke-Peterson. Now few state leaders have left such a deep imprint on their state and, I'd hazard a guess, the nation. Was Joh Bjelke-Peterson the architect of modern Queensland, or was he one of the last of Australia's political strongmen? Perhaps, as so often is the case in history, the truth lies somewhere in between. Now, for much of the 20th century, Queensland was regarded somewhat dismissively as the poor cousin of Australian states, an economy dependent on primary industries with lower levels of infrastructure, education and investment than the southern capitals of Melbourne and Sydney. But by the time Sir Joh left office in 1987, the state was growing rapidly, its cities expanding, and tourism infrastructure and services reshaped its economic base. It was a powerhouse. A major transformation had taken place. Now, the debate is about how this came about and at what cost. Joh himself was an unlikely figure to dominate politics for nearly 2 decades. He was born to Danish immigrant parents and raised on a peanut farm, leaving school at 14 and shaped by a stern Lutheran work ethic. He embodied a kind of frontier populism that resonated with many, perhaps most Queenslanders at the time. He spoke very plainly, he distrusted elites and presented himself as the defender of ordinary people, ordinary Queenslanders against distant bureaucrats, the militant unions, communists and socialists, and often Canberra itself. His premiership was one of great achievements, but also controversies such as the street march bans, the bitter industrial disputes, allegations of electoral manipulation, and ultimately the Fitzgerald inquiry, which led to his demise politically. To some, these events define his legacy. To others, they're just part of a more complicated story about power in Queensland, its development and progress, and the politics of this rapidly changing state. To help us understand the complexity of Joh Bjelke-Peterson, I'm delighted to be joined by Bruce Kingston, who has a rare perspective. He served as a ministerial speechwriter in the Bjelke-Peterson cabinets and has spent decades working in public affairs in Queensland, in politics and government, and has written a biographical monograph on Sir Joh. So I can think of no better person to talk to us about this most interesting Queenslander. Thank you for joining me on Afternoon Light, Bruce.
Thanks, Georgina. Great to be here.
I have had the pleasure or maybe displeasure of watching Joh, the Last King of Queensland, the documentary in preparation for this podcast. And I think reading your monograph and then watching a documentary like that, you can really get a flavour of the two different Johs that we're left with in the political legacy. There are very, very different views about Joh Bjelke-Peterson. And I think he is a sort of a hero and a villain in one for many people. So tell me about this most famous and infamous state premier of Queensland for 19 years. He almost got to the 20-year mark, not quite.
Yes. Well, he was in cabinet for almost 25 years, I think 24 and a half. So it was a remarkable career. He was absolutely a polarising figure. I think you either loved him or hated him. And in his heyday, more people loved him than hated him. I can't think of another state premier that's had such an impact either A, on the state or B, on federal politics, because, of course, he got heavily involved in federal politics when Gough Whitlam was Prime Minister, and I think can be easily said to have played a part in Whitlam's downfall at the end. But it is sad that, that SBS show, I'd just call that a stitch-up, really. It was just another trope about bumpkins and corruption. And I think Jerry Connolly was another figure that famously impersonated Joh as a country hick speaking gibberish, always with a piece of grass in his mouth. But the reality of him is that he's someone who oversaw the transition of, as you said, a Queensland that was in a parlour state. It was a branch office state. Very little happened. And he turned it into a vibrant economy that was rapidly expanding. But probably more than that, I think what people forget is that he understood the mood of his electorate quite well most of the time, particularly in his earlier years. That seems to have escaped him a little in the later years. But his success in reading his electorate with things like power strikes and Springbok riots and street marches, it absolutely electrified the left that he was doing things like that. But all the polling showed that the vast majority of the voting public agreed with him. And he did other things. His success in moving the Country Party from a purely rural voter base to gaining and holding urban seats, that's unheard of in any other state in Australia. So he's a man that did a lot of things, and if you love him or hate him, you'll see those things in a different form. But the one thing you can't take away from him, that the Queensland he started with and the Queensland he finished with were dramatically different beasts.
Yeah, I mean, it really was an incredible transformation. Thinking back to Queensland in the 60s, and of course, Queensland of the Menzies era, and Joh becomes Premier 2 years after Menzies' retirement from politics. They don't directly cross over. It was a Labor state. Labor had been in power at the state level. So, this was not a natural, what it is today, LNP home. So Joh was really disrupting the status quo back in the 60s. When he took the premiership in 1968, what did he inherit from the previous state Labor government? What sort of state was it?
Well, as I just mentioned, it's very much a branch office state. We had some mining, but it was relatively small and went through only a few relatively minor ports. Mount Isa Mines is probably the odd one out there. They were already a big, complex company with ports in Townsville. But rural industries were the main game, and the sleepy backwater that was Brisbane, it lacked industry and commerce, but probably more importantly, it lacked capital. And I think that's one thing that people forget, and it's one of the issues when Menzies was making his changes and bringing Australia up. Queensland got left behind in that to some extent because it didn't have the capital to develop as much as others. There wasn't as much migration into Queensland, so we didn't have them driving housing needs and therefore all the things that come with that, new schools, real estate developments, whatever. So it was a very quiet place. It wasn't all backwater, of course. I mean, Queensland elected the first ever communist member of Parliament in the 40s in Fred Patterson. Ryan and his treasurer, Red Ted Theodore, tried to start a socialist state with state-run enterprises to break the hold of the rich and landed. That was certainly an idealistic thing. Spoiler alert, it failed miserably. But Queensland also elected the first Indigenous member of the Legislative Assembly with Eric Deer from the Country Party, no less, to the seat of Cook in 74, and then Neville Bonner, who I knew and worked with to some extent, as senator in 71. So it was doing things that were unlike many of the other states. Yeah. But the thing that most people forget, and I know most Southerners, and I'm a born and bred Queenslander, so I've got an immediate dislike of all things south of the border, which Joh gave us in spades. You have to remember that 50% of Queenslanders live outside the state capital, and many of them live more than 1,000 kilometres from the capital. So in every other state and territory, the vast majority live in or close to the capital. But say Cooktown is 2,000 kilometres from Brisbane, Normanton's 2,300 kilometres. And we have half a dozen significant cities along the Queensland coast where, some 200,000 people live. And they're really quite different places. Back in the 70s, there used to be the North Queensland Air Force. There was a group of pilots that had some old warbirds. And it was a light-hearted name, but there was always an undercurrent in the locals who firmly believed that the North should be its own state, resource-rich and different from all of the others. And Joh leveraged that distrust of Southerners, whether it be to George Street in Brisbane or the Commonwealth Parliament, to pursue his aims. And it was quite clever in a sense, and he continued it. While he certainly did great damage to Whitlam during that period, he continued it under Liberal governments, and it meant that obviously lots of people in the South disliked Joh intensely. But the reality is, there's now a burgeoning commercial scene. Australians were voting with their feet, moving here in record numbers to escape problems in southern states. That, I think, is one of the great Joh legacies. And it came from having a state that had balanced budgets, funded programs, anchored with low taxes, and really tight government financial control. There was none of the let's borrow another billion to keep afloat mentality. If it didn't balance, it largely didn't get spent in Queensland.
Do you think that Joh came to the premiership in 1968 with a clear vision for Queensland? Did he see his priorities as being the complete economic rejuvenation or, opening up of the state? Was that a real focus early on?
Look, I couldn't say from anything I've seen that he entered politics with something in his heart that he was going to do. Certainly his early work life and very much his sort of Protestant work ethic is very clear. Once he's in Parliament, he wants to make things work better. And I think one of the really interesting things about Joh is that we had one of the last really good examples of a Westminster system under Joh. We had senior public servants who did or could and certainly did say no to Joh if things were too odd or too expensive or just didn't fit with what was needed at the time. So you had a public service that got on and did its job without any of the politicisation that we see nowadays in all senior roles. And that meant you had government departments that were looking to do the right thing. He also had I think, quite a Machiavellian view of government in that and we might talk about this later when we talk about corruption, but he was a leader that wanted people to get on and do their jobs and do them well, and how they did them was not as important as getting them done. So he had a constant focus on building and making things better.
So the ends justified the means, basically.
To an extent, yes. I think that was very much how he looked at things. You need to break a few eggs to make an omelette, and how it was done sometimes was not as important as getting it done.
Do you think he had a philosophical framework he drew upon? He was a representative, of course, of the Country Party, and I'm not aware of his commentary or particular interest in Robert Menzies and his political beliefs around Australian liberalism, but he obviously wasn't a member of the Liberal Party in Queensland, so presumably there was a divergence there. But a lot of his approaches were about, freeing up the market, lowering taxes, lowering the burden on people and balancing budgets, as you say. Was there a philosophical approach behind all this?
I think predominantly, as you alluded to in your opening, some of it comes from his strict Lutheran upbringing, that Protestant work ethic, espousing hard work, discipline and frugality. And that occurs as a theme in many of his decisions and battles. So Joh was never afraid of hard work. So I think that's what directed him for a lot of his life. He was also clever enough to recognise that he needed smart people around him. So I think you have to, if you look at Joh, you look at a group of people that were around Joh at the same time that were able to assist him in getting that job done. The likes of the Sir Robert Sparks, Mike Evans running the Country Party, then National Party, Callaghan, his famous press secretary. They were all bright people who were able to, again, say no to Joh, but also help direct him into what was, winnable battles.
I guess, you've referred a few times to his Lutheran upbringing. It'd be worth exploring what his upbringing was like, 'cause it was incredibly humble. The contrast, of course, of the era in the 70s is Gough Whitlam, erudite lawyer, highly educated, law at Sydney Uni, private schools. And then you have the contrast of someone like Joh Bjelke-Peterson, another very, very large figure on the, yes, Queensland Premier, but on the national political scene.
Absolutely. I mean, Joh, of course, Gough called him a Bible-bashing bastard, famously, which I think Joh probably wore with pride. His early life was one of very limited means. The family was really not far above poverty, and he was out and working at a young age, famously lived in a cow barn for, I think it was like 14 years or 15 years, while he built up businesses. He built up a series of businesses, developed properties, started farms. So he'd become, by his mid-30s, after 20-odd years of work, a relatively successful man. And but certainly by the time he was into state politics and premier, he was a wealthy man in his own right. He didn't need to go into politics to earn a living. I think that was just another part of the calling, if you will, of him wanting to do bigger things and push the state along under Premier Nicklin previously, and certainly the previous 40 years of the ALP governments. As we've touched on, there wasn't a lot happening in Queensland. And Joh recognised that there were just so many opportunities for him to assist people in making Queensland a better place to live.
His children and those close to him describe an incredible ambition and work ethic. I mean, he would get up at the light of dawn and start working on the farm, clearing land, and then he would stop as soon as the sun went down, and then he would actually develop a lighting system that would enable him not to stop when the sun went down and to keep working into the night. I mean, he was driven by something incredible, wasn't it? It was a sense of progress. He wanted to get ahead. He wanted to make money or be successful or clear more land. That is an incredible, I guess, driving force that you see not just as a farmer but through political life as well.
And that could be something that you can see in that period. It does link back to the Menzies' improvement in the state of the economy and the idea of you can work and get ahead, and the country's there to support you. Because at the same time, my dad was a self-made person, left school at grade 8, went on to start a successful furniture manufacturing and transport business, employed 120 people, all in that same period. And it was a period when you could have a go. It was relatively straightforward to start a business and get cracking. And if you're willing to put in long hours, I know my dad worked 7 days a week early on when I was a kid, and Joh was the same. He was someone that would famously sleep under his equipment in the paddock just to be able to start first light in the morning. And certainly I've heard that in politics. He was non-stop. I think the only great thing would be that he was before mobile phones. If he'd had a mobile phone, no one would have ever got any rest.
So perhaps well, at least the people around him are blessed that he was a politician before the internet and mobiles. Tell me about his political appeal. He was really, really popular. And even to this day, you hear his supporters interviewed, David Littleproud and Barnaby Joyce and Bob Catter, and they really, really deeply admire him. So he had a cut-through that was unique to him, but made him a true sort of, I guess, representative of Queenslanders, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the truth is that for many, many years in Queensland, even supposedly rusted-on blue-collar ALP voters regularly voted for Joh, agreeing with his core conservative philosophies and his just constant, unrelenting focus on creating jobs and opportunities for Queenslanders. I grew up in Ipswich, so now I probably rate special attention from social workers coming from a disadvantaged background. But that was home to at that stage, I think, the safest ALP seat in the country, which was Bill Hayden's seat of Oxley. But at the same time, it was also home to state, national and Liberal state members, including my old departed boss, Sir Lou Edwards, Joe's treasurer. Now, they may have voted for Bill at a federal level, but when the state polls came around, they voted in their spades for his can-do, no-nonsense approach. And that's probably, I think it was really clearly evidenced, as I mentioned before, the street march issues and the Springbok riots. The left became apoplectic about Joe stopping street marches. But Joe effectively used the theatre of the police and student clashes, which occurred usually mid-afternoon, perfect for evening television. And Joe's able to then be interviewed and talk about these long-haired layabouts and student radicals. And the reality was the polling of the day showed that absolutely that's what the vast majority of people thought. They didn't want a bunch of long-haired layabouts and student radicals blocking streets in our capital. Now, that might be cynical politics by the Premier, but he was also very accurately reflecting his electorate. And he did that in many different ways. He spoke up for all sorts of groups that he thought needed help, but he also could be quite laser focused on destroying what he might have seen as the ALP's opportunity to make any sort of credible comment on his government.
The Springboks tour happened in 1971, so just 3 years after he became Premier. So the South African team, South Africa was an apartheid state at the time, and there was, that was controversial, of course. And Australia was not supportive of that policy, but the debate was whether you would allow them South Africans to visit Australia and participate in sporting events, while at the same time condemning the policy of that country. Why did Joe think it was an important issue to take a stand on? Did he have a particular view on apartheid, or was it more about the student protesters who he didn't like and less about South Africa as a sort of broader issue?
I've never heard Joe speak about apartheid positively or negatively. I really just can't recall him ever making a comment on apartheid as such. I remember there being talk about apartheid was, the rules of that particular government, and therefore it's legitimate. I'd have to say, though, I think it was probably another easy mark to make, political capital against the ALP, because they, of course, were against South Africa being able to even play in Australia. And he was able to then have another police against people protesting all about a sporting event. And he, pretty certain, I don't recall the detail, but there was a lot of talk about it's just a sporting event. You can't bring politics into sporting events. And I think he quite cleverly handled it. And again, it looked like a bunch of people protesting peacefully or somewhat peacefully outside buildings in Brisbane trying to stop a sporting event.
There's a lot of allegations that Joe engaged in gerrymandering, so changing the boundaries of electorates in order to favour the Country Party or the National Party as it became, and of course disadvantage his political opponents, namely the Labor Party. Joe had, of course, inherited a political system in Queensland that only had one house. So it's a unicameral system. It doesn't have an upper house. That had been implemented by the Labor government prior to him.
Yeah.
And the electoral boundaries, as I understand, were pretty much put in place by the Labor governments at the time, and he inherited them. Yet the accusation is that it was Joe who manipulated the system to his advantage. Now, one analysis could be he just was popular and just won and, won enough votes. But there are election outcomes that are pointed to where he was winning less primary votes than Labor, but then winning more seats than Labor. So, how do you respond, Bruce, to these accusations of in South Australia, it used to be called playmandering by Tom Playford, the long-term Premier there. Was it Joe mandering?
Look, I think it's one of the hoariest of the criticisms of the Joh era. I mean, firstly, all governments attempt to engineer as legitimately as possible their longevity in office by whatever means available. But you have to remember that the Country Party, as you said, was elected in the 1950s exactly on the gerrymandered boundaries that were put in place by the Labor Party to keep them in office when they had many more people in rural Queensland as voters. So, of course, we should be more correctly talking about malapportionment than gerrymandering, because it's not so much the seat boundaries. But you also have to remember that the next time the ALP won more than 50% of the two-party preferred vote in Queensland was in 1989 when Goss won government. And by the way, he won that government on the same so-called gerrymandered boundaries. So it's a little hard to prove that. You also have to remember that during that period, Labor's vote was as low as 36%. And everybody that really talks about the so-called gerrymandering conveniently forget that in a state in those days of about, I think, 89 seats back in the 70s, the ALP commonly stood in every seat in the state. So their statewide vote was quite high. The Country Party, or later the Nats, Nationals, often stood only in seats where they were reasonably likely to win. So they didn't waste a lot of effort standing a candidate in a seat in Townsville, for instance, which had been a rusted-on ALP seat. So their votes could be as low as 20% of the primary vote. And, of course, that used to be an old thing that Joh was the 20% premier. Again, what they forget, I presume, try and forget, is that it was a coalition government and that, therefore, the two-party preferred vote was virtually always above 50%, but always above that of the ALP. So the whole idea that the gerrymander was some evil process that was put in place to keep the ALP out of office it's a bit laughable, particularly when you think in 1989, Wayne Goss won his premiership with 60% of the seats and only 50% of the vote, all based on those same supposedly gerrymandered boundaries. And then some years later, Peter Biddy won the 1998 election with about 39% of the vote, gaining 44 seats. Oddly, no one squealed gerrymander at that point.
It seems that Queensland politics delivers very extreme results. It's never a sort of a marginal, close-run thing, is it? You're always winning. When you win big. And when you lose, well, yes, you lose
absolutely.
big. Yeah. So Queenslanders are quite open to changing their votes. Do you think they're more of a swinging vote electorate than the southern states?
I don't know that they are all that different. It's more that, as I mentioned earlier, one of the issues that really comes into play is the regionalism of Queensland. You know, with half the votes taking place outside the southeast corner, there's an awful lot of people and different seats and different requirements in those seats. So the issues can be beaten up much more easily in those smaller seats. And that was something that I think Joh always understood. He was a great campaigner during election campaigns. He was sort of on the road 6.5 days out of 7 across the state, of course, in his famous plane. But he actually understood that the story that he would push in each area was dramatically different for each place. There was no such thing as, a state campaign story with Joh. He understood what was going on in Western Queensland or at Normanton or somewhere in the west of Cairns. So he was able to tailor his messages to those people and understand what they were going through.
He is known for driving significant economic reforms and infrastructure projects in Queensland that, I mean, as we said before, he's sort of the father of modern Queensland in that respect. And his reforms drove a huge influx of us southern staters to Queensland. Maybe you'd rue that day. I don't know, Bruce. He invited so many of us up there. But can you describe those reforms and what they did to the state?
Yes, yeah, we have the issue of the Mexicans keep coming up here, as they're often referred to here from the southern states. And it's one of those things that really started under Joh. I think a few Australians may have visited the Gold Coast for holidays, maybe in the 40s and 50s. But what really started by the 70s was a big migration of people into Queensland. It really started with the abolition of death duties, I think. It was the first big influx of the southerners who voted with their feet and moved to Queensland. And really, they've been driving development in Queensland ever since. You only have to look around where I am at the north end of the Gold Coast. There's new estates going in on a weekly basis, and that's all part of people moving up here to, enjoy the climate, but also enjoy what's the way of life here. But Joh's mantra was really creating a low-tax state that was pro-development and looking to do business. And, of course, the Menzies era, at the end of Menzies, he was starting to fund some significant infrastructure activities in Townsville and Gladstone, as well as granting more mining export approvals. And that probably started the perfect storm that was mining development in Queensland, which drives large numbers of companies here in the southeast, but also Gladstone, Mackay, Rockhampton. You only have to spend a little time there to understand how much they depend on mining as a business, but it also then funded all the sort of infrastructure points along the coast, the big ports, the coal ports, the developments. Probably most importantly, what they started to focus on was to not just have more things being dug up, but more mining development inputs being created here in the state, but also downstream processing, so that we then started to have the likes of the Gladstone aluminium refineries being built. And that meant, we were shipping a finished product rather than just rocks overseas. But it really meant that because mining started to gear up dramatically, you had a dramatic increase in royalties and rail freight charges. And that was something that was unusual for a Conservative government. They specifically hiked royalties and rail freight charges. I think understanding the business of the mining industry was such that they could afford it, and that by doing those things, it created this long-term, and I mean long-term, it's still basically funding a good deal of Queensland's prosperity, continues to fund the state. But that meant that they then had money for dams and bridges and highways, hospitals and ports and roads and schools, so that you could see a distinct flow and effect into communities from this pro-development, everybody works harder, we all get ahead idea of Joh and his government.
You mentioned dams, Bruce, the Wivenhoe Dam and the Bjelke-P dams. These would have been controversial projects. You're obviously interrupting the natural flow of a river system. But do people see these projects as essential for the development and, I guess, the future-proofing of Queensland? Was there general support for them, or was there a real kind of community pushback about the impacts of these dams?
There was some community pushback, predominantly, as always, the NIMBY pushback, the people who would be specifically affected by the dam or what was needed to create the dam. But certainly not in the Wivenhoe period, which is really the dam that drives southeast Queensland. It took many farms, but at the same time, it created a piece of infrastructure that was incredibly valuable to the state. But you'd have to say that was one of the things that, Joh and his government were always doing. What do we do next to keep this going? So that in the mid-80s, they were already planning the next dam, because they could see the way that southeast Queensland was expanding. And that meant it needed more water. So they then developed another dam, or the idea of another dam, in the hinterland of the Gold Coast, called the Wolfdean Dam, which would have been just slightly smaller than Wivenhoe. It would have been an important dam for two reasons. One, it gave you a very large public water source, but it also gave you the capacity to use Wivenhoe for one of the things that it was planned to be, which was to stop flooding in the Brisbane Valley. So they could let more water out. They didn't have to worry about keeping the water in and perhaps having too much and then having to let it out at the wrong time. So I don't think in those days there were people certainly against the Wolfdean Dam because they were having to take up again a whole bunch of people's personal properties, but that's a given. But you just had the burgeoning of the environment movement, and certainly that was what the environment movement, the Greens had struck a deal with the ALP as a preference swap for the 89 election. And I gather one of the deals, part of that deal, was that the Wolfdean Dam would get the kibosh as soon as Goss took government. And that's basically what they did. They stopped it entirely and then proceeded for the next 7, 8, 10 years to do nothing about water until we were in the middle of a drought.
All this development and, the infrastructure development in the Gold Coast is really quite famous, and there are stories of Joh coming down to the Gold Coast and counting all the cranes, and the number of cranes meant the sort of, I guess, prosperity and success of the state. But it does, of course, mean that politicians who are the decision makers can fall prey to the, lobbying efforts of certain property developers and then allegations of corruption. Do you think that this development, this sort of real drive to build a bigger and better Queensland, did that open the door to the corruption that in the end was the downfall of the Bjelke-Peterson government?
In a sense, yes. Anytime when the more business activity going on, the more risk of corruption there is. I think it's, sometimes people talk of corruption as if Joh brought it to Queensland as some form of original sin. Such things were unheard of in Queensland politics in the 1950s. Certainly wasn't. If you look at the Mungana affair, I think the State Treasurer and other ministers had shares in a government, in a mine. Another spoiler, ALP Minister Gordon Nuttall went to jail for taking bribes while a Minister of the Crown. The issue of corruption is, again, one I think I'd link back to Joh's Machiavellian processes. You'd have to be crazy and not to know that there was some ministers in his government that were prone to, that's a delicate way to put it, assisting business by, relieving them of cash. But I've never seen any actual proof. It's never been proven that Joh was involved in any of that. But I think he was able in his Machiavellian way to ignore that with the idea that there's a greater good going on. And again, we have, you go back to the likes of TV show we were talking about the other day. They're talking about the Fitzgerald report. It's a really boring document. I had to read it for this book. But the only 4 coalition members that actually went to jail post-Fitzgerald were members that had misused travel allowances to the tune of a few $1,000s. I mean, we weren't talking about them uncovering huge corruption in the government. There was, of course, huge corruption in the police force, but that's, particularly in that era, you only have to look at New South Wales, WA and Victoria. There's TV shows being made about the corruption in those eras. Look at Underbelly and Deepwater and Blue Murder. So there was endemic corruption in the police, probably generally in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s.
So you don't think it was something specific to Queensland? This was a sort of an Australia-wide phenomenon of that era?
Oh, I don't think you can say it was Queensland focused at all. It happens. Certainly the issues of developments bribing people to get approvals probably went up, and it's much more of a local government issue in that sense. And even recently in Queensland, there's been a couple of local governments had to have management put in place because they were taking money from developers to get approvals for projects. In Queensland, you tended to have Joh's government's view was that pretty much, it's sad in a way, but all development's good development. If someone wants to put a tourism development, if you remember, there was something called the Iwasaki Resort in Yeppoon. I personally could not understand why someone would want a holiday there, but this Japanese developer wanted to do that, so he got approval to put in a 36-hole golf course and a huge development. It lasted for about 30 years before it went broke, but that's private money. It's not money that's coming out of the state coffers. So that many of the developments that, created Cairns, Port Douglas, Townsville to a lesser extent, Whitsundays, Mackay, Rocky, Gold Coast, Noosa, this huge amounts of money was created by people wanting to come there. And Joh, and particularly Sir Lou Edwards, would be overseas on a regular basis, talking up Queensland in, at that stage, predominantly Japan, because they were the big investors, to come and to do developments here. And I live in one now. It was originally started by a company, I think, called Iwasaki.
The bête noire of the Bjelke-Peterson government of Joh was, of course, Gough Whitlam, Prime Minister of Australia from 1972 to 75. There was the infamous Gare affair as well. Was this a useful opportunity for Joh to cast the blame for all Queensland's woes at the feet of Canberra, particularly led by a Prime Minister with whom he would share absolutely no similar opinions on public policy issues?
I would have liked to have been in the room the few times they met, because I'm sure it must have been a frosty time. Certainly there's been quite a bit written in recent years about that 3 years of government, having just passed the 50th anniversary of the dismissal. But I think Joh's small business background and his social conservatism put him completely at odds with many of the Whitlam-era changes. But I think he also recognised politically that the electorate just wasn't ready for the pace of change and the ongoing crisis. And so it was very convenient to be able to blame Whitlam for just about everything. I think you may have seen there's a recent article by Dr. Scott Brasser, who said in very plain language the drama and the difficulties that turbulence caused for small business throughout Australia, but particularly for Scott's hometown and my hometown of Ipswich in Queensland, and Joh recognised that turbulence was something that he could capitalise on. And you have to say that, he picked that right, because the election immediately post-dismissal was one of the largest swings ever against the ALP in parliamentary history. Yeah. And I think Joh was quite proud of his engineering the night of the long prawns, as they called it sometimes, which kicked off the Gare affair and led to Joh appointing an ALP member, though not of the ALP's choosing, called Patrick Field, which then accelerated the process that came to be known as the dismissal.
Yes, this was appointing him to the Senate, where there was a vacancy because of the death of a Queensland senator, Labor senator. Was that a popular decision in Queensland, Joh selecting a Labor senator himself rather than allowing the Labor Party and Gough Whitlam to make sure that the right Labor senator took that spot?
Well, I'm not sure whether he had advance warning, but he specifically asked, as had happened in the past, for 3 names. He didn't want just one. And the ALP refused to do that. So in refusing to do that, that then opened the door for what Joh saw as for him to appoint someone from the ALP. So obviously, if you're a supporter of his, you thought it was a clever idea. And if you're from the ALP, it was a terrible breach of political etiquette. But it was within the rules, and probably this is one of those things Joh probably didn't think it up. I wouldn't mind betting one of his, cadre of supporters, the Sir Roberts Parks, the Mike Evans, Alan Callaghan's, probably came up with those ideas. But it accelerated the crisis, and it meant that, we didn't have a Whitlam government anymore.
Yeah. And as you say, the election after the dismissal led to a landslide for Malcolm Fraser, and he was Prime Minister until 1983. The Joh for PM campaign. Starts on a high, but in the end is a failure, ending, I guess, with an assessment that it was a hubristic foray into the federal political arena that was never ever going to work. And of course, some would argue stymied John Howard, the leader of the opposition at the time, his chance of winning government from Bob Hawke in 1987. And so we end up with a Labor government in power for 13 years, from 1983 to 96. What's your assessment of the Joh for PM campaign, Bruce?
I think so few politicians, other than, say, Sir Robert Menzies, recognised the right time to leave. Joh's position was already starting to crack a little. I think we had more people moving here, more people who had different views about how government worked. And so he'd perhaps drunk his own Kool-Aid and couldn't see that. And it's really quite common in politicians. I personally just never understood the whole Joh for PM idea. Anybody who knows anything about politics recognises it was silly. He can't possibly have won because he was never going to get more than maybe a few seats. If he got that, a couple of Senate spots, if it had actually ever come to fruition. So at best, he was only ever going to be a minor player in maybe a coalition government. But I think it was, again, it's one of those things where Joh was being driven at that stage by external forces who thought that they could, play on a bigger field. I thought it was a very sad end, I think, for Joh. It didn't make him out to look foolish. I think he really just drank the Kool-Aid and thought that he was so much in charge of Queensland he could do the same for the rest of Australia.
Joh ends up leaving the premiership in 1987. He had wanted to retire at a time of his choosing on the 8th of the 8th, 88, and that doesn't work out. He's sort of forced to go, but he does so. I mean, in the shadow of the Fitzgerald inquiry and the allegations of police corruption and some government corruption as well. But I mean, there's the story of him locking himself in his office and sort of refusing to leave for several days. I mean, does this end up being an unedifying end to his premiership, or can we look back at him disregarding that small period as someone who is a real giant of Queensland and Queensland politics and left us with an enduring legacy?
I think, as you say, it just does have an impact on his enduring legacy. If he had somewhere in the mid to late 80s engineered an exit where he was still in charge and could let someone else take over, he would have been seen as a powerful figure that, walked off into the sunset. His wife was already in the Senate, so he could have a fiddle with politics that way. But he just couldn't do it. And I think that it's so common in politicians that I've known and worked with. Once they're in charge of something, they think they know it all and they think they've got the right idea, and he just couldn't see the wood for the trees at that point. It's quite a sad reputation that he's been given by the media, I think.
Well, it's very rare in politics to leave at a time of your own choosing, and mainly you're done in by your own side, or of course by the opposition who wins government. So
yes,
it's not unusual, but he certainly needs to be remembered for the full range of his contributions, both the good, the bad, and the somewhere in the middle. But Bruce, thank you so much for reminding us of the importance of Joh Bjelke-Peterson, a larger-than-life Queensland figure who transformed the state.
Thanks, Georgina. I've enjoyed it.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.